Salve, buonasera.
Buonasera, buonasera professore Amichino, c'è anche Giovanni Antonelli?
Ciao Michela, buonasera professore, piacere di conoscerla.
Piacere.
Adesso aspettiamo un attimo.
Io per sentirmi più a casa ho messo il background del centro studi.
Ho visto. Mi devi spiegare come si fa, così me lo metto anch'io.
È facile. Basta andare sulle impostazioni generali, c'è sfondo e poi carichi l'immagine.
Ecco, c'è anche Giusy, vedo.
Michela? Ciao,
Sì.
ciao Giovanni.
Ciao Giusy.
È fortissima questa cosa che hai fatto, bravo.
Grazie.
Grazie. Stiamo aspettando il presidente e il professor Vermeule?
Sì.
Bene. Poi Giovanni, quando puoi, magari ci facciamo un appuntamento?
Sì,
anche col nuovo direttore?
Certamente. Anche perché l'avevo già accennato a Michela, devo ancora darvi il pensierino di Natale, quindi contavo di passare.
Sei troppo gentile, ma non dovevi.
Di passare anche settimana prossima, potrebbe andare bene.
Va bene. Buonasera professore Annichino, sono Giusy Desio, sono il vice direttore del centro.
Buonasera a lei, grazie per l'impeccabile organizzazione e per l'invito.
Grazie a lei, grazie infinite per aver accettato l'invito.
No, ci mancherebbe per il centro studi questo ed altro. Io sono molto legato al centro studi, quindi...
Sì.
No, io colgo solo l'occasione perché purtroppo ho un altro impegno. Sono Roberto Sgalla, sono nuovo direttore.
Buonasera,
Saluto poi Giusy, che è la vera, come dire, il vero pilastro del centro, la memoria storica di assisterà. Però mi faceva piacere, già ho sentito appunto Giusy che ragionava di un possibile incontro. Chiaramente per me è un piacere in base ai vostri impegni. Un grazie sincero di aver accettato questo invito e di condurre questo dibattito, sia moderandolo e sia chiaramente partecipando direttamente. Veramente un grazie sincero. Credo che aspettiamo solo il presidente Amato e il professore, giusto?
Sì.
Ovviamente, come diceva Giusy, mi farebbe piacere perché noi poi siamo, tanto possiamo rubare qualche minuto, ancora ci siamo, come dire, alla ricerca anche di nuovi stimoli, tra virgolette, su cui poter ragionare e riflettere. Quindi chi meglio di voi può darci una mano a individuare all'interno, chiaramente, dei filoni strategici che voi conoscete, geopolitica, economia, chiaramente tutto il tema del green, stiamo ragionando sul tema della sicurezza informatica su vari versanti, quindi diciamo che gli argomenti poi sono tantissimi, non ce n'è uno solo, purché tutto abbia chiaramente sia rivolto anche a oltre Atlantico, ma questo è scontato, è tautologico, ecco, veramente siamo alla ricerca di nuovi stimoli, veramente, perché non perché il centro non ne abbia avuti, però proprio per riuscire ad arrivare anche a un pubblico più vasto, a interessare i nostri soci, che chiaramente il nostro core business lo viviamo in tanto in quanto ci sono i soci, quindi è importante rispondere anche alle loro esigenze, alle loro aspettative. Quindi veramente vi aspettiamo con molto piacere, diceva appunto Giusy, lo ribadisco, io sono esattamente 8 giorni oggi, quindi ancora mi perdo nel centro, quindi ancora sono a questo livello qui, cioè non so quali sono le stanze, per cui Più di questo non sono in grado di dire, ovviamente, siccome non mi sono mai, non credo ai tuttologi, nemmeno lo sono io assolutamente, quindi con molto, come dire, con passo felpato e con molto rispetto e anche soggezione, oserei dire. Però ecco, da figure come le vostre di rilievo, eccetera, ci aspettiamo un aiuto, ecco, vi chiediamo questo, senza, come dire, parafrasare frasi che sono state dette in questi giorni, aiutateci, non volevo arrivare a questi livelli, non abbiamo questa pretesa, però ecco, dateci una mano, siamo molto più, come dire, dateci una mano. Grazie, buon lavoro. Aspetto un attimo per salutare il Presidente Amato, perché, come dire, è il mio, come dire, uno dei miei capi, quindi giusto anche l'atto di cortesia, e poi lascio a voi chiaramente il lavoro. Ancora, Michela, il Presidente Amato non si è collegato, vero? Michela, non ti sentiamo però.
Scusate, avevo disattivato il microfono per non interferire. E ancora non risulta collegato. Adesso stiamo monitorando.
Aspettiamo qualche minuto, tanto siamo in perfetta...
Di solito il presidente, devo dire che è di una puntualità svizzera.
Quindi no. A Boston, perché a Boston, che orario è? Quante sono le ore? 6 o di più il flusso?
6.
6.
Sì.
Sì, sono le 11:30 di mattina. In effetti manca anche il professore. Giovanni, non so se tu hai il suo numero di telefono, devo fargli uno squillo.
Ora provo a contattarlo. Oddio, cos'è?
Devo dire, ancora manca 5 minuti abbondanti, quindi siamo...
Ciao, Serena.
Credo che si sia connesso il professor Vermiule. Hello, Adrian.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, how are you? Good to see you.
Yes, you too. Long time no see.
Yeah.
Good morning, Professor Vermiule.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for doing this. I can't hear you.
It's on mute.
Good morning. Good morning. It's Michaela.
Oh,
Nice
good
to
morning. Thank
meet
you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
È vero. Good evening, Professor. I am Sgalla Roberta. I am Director of the Center Study of the American. Buonasera. Good evening.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for hosting me.
Michela, chi manca? Manca solo il Presidente Amato, giusto?
Sì, sì.
Mai?
Io ho sentito la sua segreteria poco tempo fa, magari li risentiamo un attimo.
Yeah, we still have a few minutes.
Pasquale, I owe you an email about joining your class. The 29th is my wife's birthday, but I'll try to send you some other date.
Don't worry about that. Your wife's birthday comes first, for sure.
Thank you.
But
no, it sounds fun. Yeah.
I will send you one thing. We are organizing a workshop on one thing which might be of interest to you. So I will also send that to you.
Okay, very good.
As you can imagine, the situation also in Austria is not easy. They have prolonged the lockdown now until February the 8th, but let's see, because now there is this British and this Brazilian variant, and nobody knows what can happen in 2 or 3 weeks.
Good luck. What's the state of lockdown in Italy right now?
Well, Italy has this actually done through administrative law, which would be interesting to discuss. It's you have several zones, so you have yellow, orange, and red zones. So depending on the color of the region, you have certain other civil rights that you can exercise. So usually, if you are in the red zone, basically you stay home. If you are in a yellow zone, you have a little bit higher degree of freedom. So it really depends.
I can't hear.
No, I think that they're speaking with the secretary of Judge Amato to allow him to join.
Oh, I see.
I think he was in the court probably.
Giovanni, how are things at EUI?
Well, EUI is also, I think, probably is in lockdown. No, I have spoken with some people there. Not Giovanni?
Yeah, but they are slowly reopening because Tuscany is currently in the yellow zone, so they are allowed to do something. But I'm currently in Rome because I'm in the orange zone, so it's not easy to travel back and forth from Rome to Florence. And furthermore, the trains are not much like before the lockdown. So it's not easy.
Yeah, this is a peculiarity of the Italian lockdown because like Germany and other countries, they have not adopted this limit on travels between regions. So like in Germany, even during the lockdown, you can easily go from Berlin to Frankfurt. But in Italy, no. I mean, it's very complex to travel between regions.
Yeah, it is. What about in Boston, in the Cambridge area? How is going there?
In theory, we're in some sort of moderate lockdown, but you know, it's America. There are no real rules.
But like the universities are closed, no?
Yeah. Well, that's not quite true. I mean, some of them, like Notre Dame, are open, but Harvard is closed.
So this means that you are teaching online.
Harvard Law School is closed. Sorry. Go ahead.
This means that you are teaching online or what?
Yes, I'm strictly online for the whole year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Probably starting from tomorrow, something new will happen. Some new regulation, you know, given the.
I think that President Amato has arrived. Bro. I see him now.
I'm here.
Oh, wonderful.
Presidente Amato, buonasera, sono il direttore. Un saluto e buon lavoro. Vi lascio a una discussione estremamente interessante che per un po' di tempo potrò ascoltare, poi purtroppo ho un impegno. Grazie di aver accettato e buon lavoro. Passo la parola al moderatore, al dottor Antonelli.
Grazie direttore, grazie. Thank you. So I think if Michela or Giusy can give me the okay to start, okay? Okay, I go ahead.
Okay, start.
Okay, so welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today in this live talk. My name is Giovanni Antonelli, and I will be chairing this event for over the next hour or so to the best of my abilities, of course. Before getting started, please let me thank the Center for American Studies in the person of its president, Mr. Giovanni De Gennaro, the honorary president, Honorable Judge Giuliano Amato, the director, Roberto Sgalla, the board, and the entire staff for the organization of this event, and mostly for their hard work in these circumstances. Another special thanks goes, of course, to our speakers of today. Thanks for your commitment and for being available in the eve of some important events, both in Italy and in US. A practical instruction for our participants. We will keep the last part of our conversation to either comments or questions. So feel free to leave a question or comments in the Q&A text box. It's now time to kick off our event. Our speakers will respond to the following question: can the administrative state be lawful? And by doing this, we will take the opportunity to present and discuss Professor Adrian Vermeule's latest book, Law and Leviathan, Redeeming the Administrative State, co-authored with Professor Carl Sunstein and published by the Harvard University Press. Of course, the role of law is always important, and a reflection on it may have a specific urgency in 2021. There are clearly several pressing dynamics that are pressuring the rule of law concern. For example, on one hand, we can see in many nations who don't obey the rule of law. On the other, in many nations, there is clearly a visible feeling about the fact that the regulatory state is undermining or threatening the rule of law. But in the same nations, on the other hand, there are supporters of the administrative state, and they argue that an administrative state is constitutionally mandatory or furthermore essential to promoting common good in our society. So in this general frame, it's now time to kick off this event by introducing our first speaker, Adrian Vermeule, professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School. He is an outstanding and inspiring scholar and, of course, a prolific author. His many books include Law's Abnegation, From Law's Empire to the Administrative State, and The Constitution of Risk. So after this introduction, over to you, Professor Adrian Vermeule.
Thank you so much, Giovanni, and I'd like to extend your thanks to everyone who's participating, to the director for hosting us, to Justice Amato for joining us, to Professor Anachino for joining us, to you for moderating, and to Michaela for organizing everything. It's been wonderful. So I'm excited to be here, and I should just clarify at the outset that I'm not speaking for my co-author, Cass Sunstein, who's perfectly capable of speaking for himself. Let me begin with what I take to be some methodological background for the book. The book is, it's about American administrative law, but I think it offers some evidence for a broader phenomenon, which I take to be the triumph of general principles in the administrative state that indeed help the administrative state to be lawful, to count as a lawful state. And these principles are a type of legal norm that are outside the purely positivist categories of rules and commands. They are a different type of legal norm. Some version of these principles appears in many legal systems. They're extremely widespread. They're often discussed under the heading of natural procedural justice or some formulation of this sort. They may happen to be written down, but they're not essentially written down. So for example, our Administrative Procedure Act refers to these principles, but they were in our law long before the Administrative Procedure Act, and they're developed and applied through jurisprudence, basically. So when I speak of administrative law, I'm using the term law at least as much in the sense of use as in the sense of lex. So when our courts use these principles, they don't really bother to determine what exactly is their source in positive law. They just use them. And if pressed, they'll say vague or ambiguous things. Well, they're inherent in due process. They're part of our legal tradition. They are background constitutional principles. But there's no anxiety about sort of what their source in positive law is. And in a moment, I'll say that this is a classically Dworkinian picture of law that is operating in the administrative state. These principles harken back to the jus commune of European law, and I think that it's a very important way to connect American law with European law. I have here a wonderful book that I'll just hold up for the camera. It's in a series called the Jus Commune Casebooks for the Common Law of Europe, and it's about administrative law they examine 6 European countries. Unfortunately, Italy is not among them. But what they say in all these countries is that general principles have been at the center of the development of administrative law. In all jurisdictions, these principles are rooted in the rule of law and are developed in case law by jurisprudence. Indeed, I think we can go farther back. So the esteemed Professor Anichino kindly sent me some of his thoughts beforehand. And one of them I thought quite rightly was that we should look at medieval canon law because the church in some ways pioneered the administrative state and kind of legal bureaucracy. And he recommended to me to revisit Harold Berman's book. And, Berman says this quite explicitly. He says, the integration of canon law proceeded from a belief that underlying the multiplicity of legal rules and procedures was a set of basic legal principles. And it was the task of jurists to identify those principles and to shape the law so they would conform to them. The jurists thought in terms of principles. And I would add Dick Helmholtz's wonderful book on the jus commune does exactly the same thing, not just for canon law, but for the Roman law as well. So methodologically, I think this is an entirely Dworkinian account of the administrative state. So, Dworkin's famous claim, which he may or may not have repudiated at some point in his life, but I still think it was correct, is that in addition to rules and commands, we have to see law as composed of principles that are a type of legal norm with different features than rules and commands. And I think that's emphatically the picture that we mean to advance in the book. Okay, if the book is methodologically Dworkinian, the actual principles it describes are taken from Fuller, an American legal scholar of the 50s. His peak career was in the 50s. And Fuller specified 8 ways that the rule of law may miscarry, may misfire I won't list them all. They're pretty familiar, but just to give you the flavor, some of them are the abuse of retroactivity, in the sense that people can't rely on current rules and are constantly under the threat of unexpected change, issuing contradictory rules, a mismatch between the rules that are announced and the rules that are actually applied, and so on. And when you apply these principles to administrative law, we find in American administrative law, and this book that I was happy to find strikingly finds in European administrative law, it finds principles like agencies have to follow their own binding rules unless and until they're changed. Retroactive rulemaking is disfavored and has to be limited to prevent abuse. Official agency declarations of law must match the rules that agencies actually apply, and so on. And the meat of the book is working through these principles to show how they constitute the lawfulness of the administrative state. They're what makes the administrative state a lawful state. In that sense, we following Fuller, call them a morality of administrative law. I don't mean that to be philosophically contentious or sort of heavy. By morality, I mean just the internal logical integrity of legal principles that helps law to function so as to respect the rational human dignity of those subject to it. And I'm here following an account of the rule of law by John Tassiulis from Oxford, who I think captures Fuller wonderfully. And he says the point of these principles is to respect the rational dignity of the subjects of law. With that account, we don't need to take any side in the old debates between Hart and Fuller about whether these principles are necessary for something to even count as law in the first place. We don't need that. I think Tassiulis gets it exactly right when he says that the Fuller principles have what he calls conditional intrinsic value, which means that, here's an analogy. They're like the virtue of courage. So the virtue of courage can be put to bad ends. You could imagine a courageous bank robber. But at the same time, it's true that the virtue of courage is most fully present when it's put to good ends. So it has an intrinsic value that's nonetheless conditional on the ends to which it's put. And that is Tassiulis's account. And I think it's exactly right about these principles. Okay, I'm almost done. I just wanted to bring out a couple more points, which is that the principles have dimensions both of scope and of weight. And for Dworkin, this is what is defined as a legal norm as a principle, that it has these dimensions of scope and weight. So for scope, Fuller insisted that there were areas of government action not susceptible to the rule of law at all. So he thought there were areas where government can act outside the rule of law. Now that's a very controversial claim nowadays. I'll just give you his examples. He said military command on the battlefield, certain types of management decision-making. So his example was if you're trying to extract electricity from tides and you need to build a sort of plant to do so, that's not susceptible to governance through legal rules. And a third was allocation of scarce economic resources among competing claimants. So problems of local justice, like allocating financial resources between public programs. And it's a very deep principle of American administrative law, at least, that the administrative state is to have nearly unfettered discretion in the allocation of resources and the solution of what philosophers call problems of local justice. Okay, so that's all about scope. As to weight, Fuller thought that his principles were not absolute, or rather that there was a structure in which there's a minimum morality of duty that the administrative state has to meet to be lawful, but there's also further aspiration a morality of aspiration above that minimum floor. And above that minimum floor, it's ordinary, it's common that there are trade-offs between our rule of law ideals on the one hand and other things we find desirable on the other hand, what Dworkin would call policies. So let me just take retroactivity as a brief example. Our Supreme Court says retroactivity is not favored in the law, but it's not per se automatically illegal. Why is that? Well, there has to be a balancing of the harms of retroactivity. There has to be a balancing of the harms of retroactivity against the reasons that a government body, an agency or tribunal wants to use retroactivity. And there are some sorts of cases in which it's important for an agency to be able to use retroactivity. So what the courts do is they put it in the category of things agencies can do if they have a sufficiently powerful reason. Okay, we can get into more details in the discussion. The largest point I want to make is simple, and I mean, here's my largest claim. We see the aim, or the book sees the aim of administrative laws to establish a common framework to regulate and civilize ongoing disagreements about the administrative state. And we want to suggest a framework grounded in a certain conception of the rule of law to do that. And in my view, that conception of the rule of law draws on a very old jurisprudence of principles that has deep roots in the jus commune, and that helps, I think, to connect American administrative law to European administrative law, insofar as they, as my colleague at Harvard, Tamar Herzog, emphasizes, they actually emerge from a common legal tradition. Okay, thank you so much. I look forward to your thoughts.
Many thanks for your remarks, Professor Bernoulli. And now I'm extremely happy to give the floor to the Honorable Judge Giuliano Amato. Thank you.
Well, it's a very intriguing kind of discussion for me, because as a European, if you ask me, allow me to be very frank, if you ask me, but can the administrative state be lawful? I would answer, we gave an answer to this question a couple of centuries ago, after the French Revolution, when the administration of the absolute state that was lawless, quod principi placuit legis habet vigorem, was a sort of tiger in our systems, entitled to derogate to any rule existing in the name of public interest, of the police power of the state. And the police power of the state was somehow the same thing as the raison d'etat initially. There was no judicial restraint, no jurisdiction on actions by the state and its officials adopted in the name of the raison d'etat of the police power. The Conseil d'Etat in France built up the answer to the initial question of your construction. Little by little, the tiger was tamed, and limits, one after the others, were built around it. In a paper that I wrote 20 years ago, I focused upon a gradual phenomenon that I named the unbundling of public interests, because initially public interest was a sort of big cloud covering any kind of interest the state could have. And we had primary and secondary public interests protected by the same act. The judicial action, mostly the judicial action, you have said it, of the Conseil d'État produced this unbundling in the sense that each measure should give the reasons to be adopted in one specific public interest. And different branches of public administrations were empowered to adopt measures in relation to one or the other public interest, which made judicial control upon them much more keen. Is the measure appropriate? Is the measure proportionate? And the excess of power became a powerful weapon in the hand of the judiciary to declare illegal this or that measure. The paradox is that in the 20th century, little by little, there were many more legal guarantees versus administrative acts than in the area of civil law generally. Your legal systems adopted administrative law much later, substantially by the end of the 19th century, to protect those interests that were not covered by the common law rules and principles. Infants' rights, public housing, social protection, etc., etc. And something that happened was that initially, let's say in the UK, the administrative tribunals, as they were named, to protect these specific public interests, were given a discretion much higher than the discretion that at the same time in the continent our public administrations had. There was no judicial scrutiny. There were no rules. Actually, in the UK, the first legal act setting procedural and substantive rules for this arrived even later than your, Administrative Procedural Act of 1946. In the UK, they had a similar act in 1958. And so the rule of law entered also this area. It has always been surprising for me because on the one side, I remember the previous years when nothing was beyond the jurisdiction of ordinary courts, and even public action was subject to ordinary courts. This was one of the main features of common law. When the systems used to common law adopt administrative law and principles, they somehow abandon the rules of basic rules of their systems, and it will take time for them to restore also in this area the rule of law, which is exactly what you are doing with your book, based on Fuller, exactly, on the Wong case in 1950, and on this beautiful concept that you use of the morality of law that empowers on the one side and constrains on the other. Interestingly enough, most of the principles that you rightly state in your book come from judicial action more than from legislative acts. So this is something that I found impressive in reading your book. Initially, the principles stated by Fuller, and little by little the case law through which these principles actually become legal principles and not only general values. Nowadays, I would say we are very similar. We are very similar also because some of our colleagues have discovered global administrative law. And in the global sphere, you see that those common principles are applied almost everywhere. Retroactivity finds limit in any multinational organization where there is a judicial body deciding on cases and controversies. Motivation is essential. It's a general principle. Where does it come from, you ask correctly? It is there. It is part of our legal context. It might be written here, it might be implied there, it does exist anyway. And so we have this wider than our national legal systems, legal context in which administrative law is based on the rule of law. Something that is interesting as a symptom of the connection between the idea that there has to be a general morality and the specific implementations of it comes from the case law of our European Court of Justice. As you know, we have in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union, the rule of law as a basic principle. We have named it value. It had been named the principle before. It is value now. It is not clear to me why there was this change and what is the precise difference. Anyhow, we treat it as a principle, but the European Court of Justice never adopts a decision on the only general basis of the rule of law, but pointing at a violation because there is no motivation in that act, because the court that has adopted is not sufficiently independent. Because of another reason, it says this act is against a system based on the rule of law. So the rule of law remains as a sort of framework, and the real content is given by the specific principles that have nurtured it in your and in our experience. This is one of the reasons by which I tend to think that the US and Europe have much more in common than many of their political leaders sometimes tend to think. And this is enough for me.
Thanks so much, Judge Amato, for your inspiring remarks. I think, Professor Vermeulen, we end the first round and then I give you the floor for your comments. So the next speaker is Professor Nichino, visiting professor of law at the Central European University. So please, the floor is yours, Professor.
Many thanks, Giovanni. Let me thank, first of all, the organizer of this event, and of course, President Amato and Professor Vermeulen, especially Professor Vermeulen, for inviting me. I have to confess, and Professor Vermeulen knew it when he sent to me the email to invite me to present. He said, I know that this is not really your particular field of interest, but I think that you must say something to contribute to the discussion. And of course, I agreed to that as a very close observer of American legal reality, and especially American legal ideologies, in a sense. And you will see why I use that term, ideologies. I mean, President Amato has said whatever needed to be said there. President Amato probably does not remember that, but when I was a first-year PhD student, I was attending some of his course in the Cappella at the European University Institute. And I remember conversation around these topics in the Cappella on the seminar of comparative constitutional law. And, you know, so I have, of course, nothing to add to what technically Professor Amato and President Amato has said, but I feel I can add some remarks a little bit maybe spicy in a sense from a legal ideological perspective, and challenge a little bit Professor Vermeulen and see where we end up this evening, because I think this can be a very interesting conversation. So what in the essence the book, and of course the reply to the book, proposes a framework, as Professor Vermeulen has already stressed in his initial intervention, for restoring confidence in government bureaucracy, which already is a quite challenging task in a period where, especially in the US, we read every day conversation and discussion on the so-called deep state. So I would say that interestingly enough, and especially interestingly enough because we have Professor Vermeulen here, would have been probably less surprising from an legal ideological point of view if we would have had Professor Sunstein here to have a defense of the deep state here, which also tells a lot about the importance and relevance of the legal reconstruction that Professor Vermeulen says. Basically, from a baseline viewpoint, Professor Vermeulen and Professor Sunstein express skepticism on minimalist approaches to government power. And this is already a program and a very important position in the American context, of course. They write very up to the point issues. They say in page 5, for instance, why would people be freer without child labor laws, without occupational safety laws, without food safety laws, and so on, all the kind of tasks on which agencies are entrusted with in the US or in Europe, as Professor Amato stressed before. And such arguments on a topic which is very dear to me because I do work in that area, of course I have strong connection also on issues like national security laws. And there are some issues there which, you know, are of particular relevance, I think. For all the region of level at the government's intelligence law enforcement and intelligence analysis, would citizenry have greater liberties if terrorism would run unchecked without any role of the bureaucracy and the deep state, or call it whatever you want? So this is a key question arise basically from the different reflection that we can make on this book. And many of them are, of course, already present in the title, that the two authors have chosen for the book, and that has a larger implication and go beyond the US. I mean, Law and Leviathan, it's really a big title, which carries with it, I would say, very large legal theoretical implication, which go far beyond administrative law. And I think that the two authors go a little bit in this pendulum, if I can say. Part of the book focuses on, rightly so, legal administrative law technicalities in the US. But you see in the book that sometimes the authors, of course, have all the capacity to go beyond that. And sometimes they self-restrain themselves a little bit. And they try to reshift and just say, oh, we want to talk only about the US administrative law. There is a very rich bibliographical apparatus at the end of the book. I mean, all the relevant cases you will find them there. So there is a little bit this swinging pendulum there. And I want to go and jump in the middle of that pendulum and see if we can move the pendulum on the other direction, in a sense, than the one which focuses strictly on administrative law. And one thing, I noted down some remarks here, and one thing which I thought through is this issue of the flavor of the book. To me, the book has had a kind of flavor, which I could grasp while, flavor of the book, which I could grasp while I was going through the different pages. So when I was reading the book, I was taken between two different feelings, as I was brought into opposite direction, as I said. One direction is the direction I did not want to go, even though, as I said, is of particular interest, which is the direction of clear administrative law and US technicalities, the Chevron doctrine, the non-delegation doctrine, and all these issues which are challenged there in the book, which are of course of highly important legal remedies. But I was trapped also in another feeling, which I immediately perceived as more powerful and more appealing to me, and which concerned the larger legal theoretical implication of the book. I must say that I realized that Adrian Vermeulen and Hans Sasten could have written this book only because they were, both of them, coming from Chicago, and maybe especially from a kind of particular Chicago environment, I would say. But I wait for Adrian to confirm that, because I did not discuss this with Professor Vermeulen, which is the Posnerian Chicago environment. And by Posnerian, I mean Richard Posner, not Eric Posner. I mean, I studied legal theory some years ago, and I had my colleagues which would make a little bit fun of me, because of course we were all reading Kelsen and Hart and working, but I would used to take some time off and take the books by Richard Posner and read the books, and people would come to me, but why are you reading this American that do legal theory? I mean, they could not understand the relevance of reading American scholars doing jurisprudence, somebody like Posner was doing. And by reading the book by Professor Vermeulen and Constantin, two books by Richard Posner came to my mind, which are The Problems of Jurisprudence and Overcoming Law. And I think that through the pages of the book, I could read a little bit the feeling of the problems of jurisprudence and overcoming law. Of course, one of the main arguments made by Richard Posner is a pragmatical approach, legal pragmatism. And I think that this is a kind of fil rouge also in the book that Professor Vermeulen and Constantin and of their larger theoretical proposal. I think that it has a deep Posnerian flavor in that sense. But I want to see if Professor Vermeulen confirms that or not from a legal theoretical perspective. And I would say that I then went up and looked for Richard Posner article on administrative law. I could not remember of all the publication that Richard Posner wrote, of course. And I found out that in 1996, on the Chicago Kent Law Review, Richard Posner wrote exactly an article on administrative law. And he made a very important theoretical and historical point, which is also made by Professor Vermeulen and Professor Sunstein. And Richard Posner wrote in 1996, discussing on the administrative state, the legality of the administrative state, why do we have the administrative state, and so on, the kind of question that we are discussing today. Very easy to understand point. Posner writes, you cannot have a big government, the government that tries to do more than secure the night watchman state with just courts and legislatures. So when demand for a big, at first just bigger federal government arose toward the end of the 19th century, the constitutional mold had to be broken and the administrative state invented. And I think this is, you know, what Posner is suggesting and what Vermeulen and Sunstein are suggesting is, grow up, face the reality. This structure of the state is here and is not going away. Now, this position is a very important position in the American legal theoretical debate, and especially in the conservative American legal theoretical debate. And this is why it's very important that Professor Vermeulen defends this position here, I think. Because another important article that Professor Vermeulen and Constantine wrote before publishing this book is was on libertarian administrative law. Now, we as European scholars do not have the same kind of debate on libertarian legal theories that Americans have. We have much more a consensus on the role of the state in society, and a book like the one that Professor Vermeulen and Constantine have written could not have been written probably by European scholars. And I think that much of the ideological debate behind the book is driven by this American debate and this ideological role that libertarianism has had in intellectual American debates. And I think that if you read the book, which I recommend to all the scholars which have an interest on American legal ideas, I think that is one of the best, which was written by a political science scholar, by the way. It's a book written by Stephen Telles, published by Princeton University Press in 2008, which is The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, a very important intellectual and political force in the development of doctrines and ideas in the American legal environment. You understand the relevance of legal libertarianism in the US and to what Professor Vermeulen and Professor Sunstein are reacting. We have to say that, in fact, a reply to Professor Vermeulen and Professor Sunstein came from that movement as a book published by Richard Epstein. And we constantly see these debates between the two kind of approaches there. So I think that that is very important, which has implication not only for administrative law, I would say. Professor Vermeulen and Constantine don't deal with that in the book, but my impression is that this has implication for constitutional law, largely as well, because these debates and this intellectual positioning also affects the debate on the so-called constitution in exile, the debate on the role of originalism in interpretation of legal text. These dots are all connected. And if you attack one of the dots, then you also have to deal with the others. This is my impression, and this is why I say we cannot simply shadow ourselves under the fact that, oh no, but we are here just to discuss very small administrative law details and adjust things. I think that the debate is much larger, very important, and with a very important implication. And I was surprised that in the article published by Professor Vermeulen and Professor Sunstein on libertarian administrative law, they quote a concurrence opinion in the case of Ettings versus United States by Judge Brown, which in terms of legal narrative, I find very interesting and very revealing, because Judge Brown in that case decided in 2012, wrote that America's cowboy capitalism was long ago disarmed by a democratic process increasingly dominated by powerful groups with economic interest antithetical to competitors and consumers. And the courts for which the victim of burdensome regulation sought protection have been negotiating the terms of the surrender since 1930s. And I think this is, you know, the legal ideological narrative which is at stake here, how America represents itself. And actually this image of the American cowboy and extended freedom is an image that we Europeans has always said, because we always said, oh, but you know, Europe is a more socialist, more role of the state, more welfare state, more bureaucracy and so on. In America, there is more freedom than this cowboy imagery. And then in 2012, you get a judge from the DDC court, which, you know, criticizing American courts and American legislative for the surrender against this kind of narrative. So I think that this is the kind of intellectual debate which is at stake here. And I would like to see the reaction of Professor Vermeulen to that. Now, a particular topic which is of interest for me, as I mentioned in the introduction, is the issue of national security, because it has to. I mean, I have been serving for a few years, also in actually another experience that was invented by President Amato, which is the Council for the Relationship with Muslim Communities at the Italian Minister of Interior. We always discuss this issue of radicalism, terrorism, national security, the role of the state, prevention of radicalization, and so on. And the issue with administrative law is what is the role of the courts, what is the role of the agency, who is best placed to make decision close to the facts, in a sense. And there is an implicit question in the book discussion and in the arguments: when should we as a society substitute the judgment of one set of unelected officials, which are the bureaucrats, with the judgments of another set of unelected officials, which are the judges, which you understand that as a point of constitutional balance is a difficult decision to make. And Law and Leviathan favors a sort of a middle approach. In Italy, we would call it democristiano, Christian Democrats. It's a kind of a moderate approach. Probably Adrian likes that. Maybe he will use that in the future, which is in line also with another important debate, which is, you know, the current shape of the US Supreme Court, the balance within the court with the coming to the court of certain judges like Judge Gorsuch, which has been vehemently critical, and this role that Judge Roberts is taking on board as the kind of moderator, the great moderator of the court, the preserver of the heritage of the court, and so on. So there is also that debate on the court there. I want to finish with just final stimulation, which is the larger legal, theoretical, and historical implication. It's true that in a conversation that we had with Professor Vermeulen, I tried to connect this book. When I graduated from University of Siena, I won a scholarship to go at Emory Law School. So I spent 8 months there, which were the last 8 months of life of Professor Harold Berman. Now, Professor Harold Berman for me is a kind of mythological creature, because he was like 90 years old. I would used to go to his office, and he would tell me the story of his teaching of Soviet law at Harvard Law School. And then he proposed to Harvard Law School to teach a seminar on Christian law. And people at Harvard were like thinking, why this guy wants to teach Christian law? And he was trying to explain at Harvard Law School that was relevant to understand historical developments of the Western legal tradition. And therefore he started there, and then he moved to Emory. Now, in his very well-known book of 1983, Law and Revolution on the Western legal tradition, Harold Berman makes some important claims. One was raised by Professor Vermeulen before: the Papal Revolution and the creation of Western states. So the split between the churches and institution and the creation of the church, and then the creation of an administrative apparatus by the church, in a sense. But also Harold Berman makes at least other 3 arguments. The role of princely power in German territories manifested itself in governmental institutions similar to those that have been developed by the first princely power of the papacy, and later by the princely power of the secular kingdoms of Sicily, England, Normandy, France. And they had a treasury, a judiciary, a chancery, and also other departments of government, civil and criminal courts, and other branches of law. The combination of these factors, if you read Harold Berman table of content, and if you go through the book, were really the kind of backbone for the creation of an administrative law of the jus commune, we can call it, which was a particular administrative law, because at that time it was an administrative law without the state, which can help us understand today why we have scholars that talk about global administrative law in an out of the state scenario, with the kind of things and principles that President Amato was discussing before. And according to Berman, these different principles and approaches were an integral part, I'm quoting from Berman, of an overarching structural process. And that structural process, Berman calls it the Western legal tradition, which I think is of particular relevance, of course, if you connect these arguments with all Fullerian arguments on the morality of the law. I think that there is a very fine line between Fuller and Berman there, from a legal theoretical point of view, that we need to explore, because that position, our Western legal tradition, which, as President Amato said before, I find it very close between the US and Europe, vis-a-vis other legal traditions in the world. Now, I'm not necessarily claiming that our legal tradition is better than other. Every week I teach to a class composed at CU by students coming from Indonesia, from Africa, from South America, and we have a very intense discussion on the legal tradition and different approaches, especially as far as human rights are concerned. But I think that we should do more work and research, and administrative law can be a very good starting point in rediscovering the treasure of this Western legal tradition, and Berman and Fuller, through Vermeule and Sunstein, can be a very good starting point. So I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Professor Nechino, for ending your reflection on this debate. Very useful, and thank you again. I think if Professor Vermeule agrees, he can respond to the comments. So the floor is yours again.
Thank you. And thank you to both of the commentators. I thought those were really illuminating and engaging and interesting. So I'm very grateful. I'm going to keep my response brief just because I already spoke, and say that I want to start with President Amato's point at the end of his remarks that there's more commonality and continuity between the US and Europe than people understand. And I think that's profoundly true, and it's what I've been trying to argue in terms of these general principles of law being the way that we legalize the administrative state. But I'd go further and say that there's not only commonality now, but there's more commonality and continuity over time than people realize. And part of the reason people think that there are sharp discontinuities, like the late 19th century for common lawyers and so on, is that I think common lawyers in particular have propounded a couple of different myths, frankly, that try to emphasize discontinuity that doesn't really exist. So one of the myths is a radical disjunction between English common law on the one hand and continental jus commune on the other hand, which they see as, or they try to portray as, absolutist. I think that's been pretty convincingly shown to be mythological by people like Dick Helmholtz, who emphasize the pervasive influence of the jus commune on the formation of the common law. And the flip side of that is, for Helmholtz, the jus commune is not absolutist in any important sense. That is, as far back as you can go in European law, there is an important set of principles of legality that are taken to structure the authority of the governing power, whether you call it a state or not. So the maxim that Justice Amato cites, quote, principi placuit, has counterparts. One of its counterparts is the vox digna, the idea that the king should, as a matter of kind of comity, ordinarily behave according to the law. And this is a serious principle that is taken seriously. It's taken seriously by judges who will interpret edicts or interpret legal claims in accordance with background principles of natural justice by ascribing to the king or the emperor the intention to act in accordance with law, unless it's very, very clear that the king or emperor has not done so. So it enters into the legal, enters into jurisprudence as a powerful kind of principle of interpretation with gravitational force. You also see this kind of self-limitation in edicts created by the imperial power itself. So a nice example is in the constitutions of Melfi from Sicily. And it's full of legal principles that are intended to regulate the conduct of imperial officers. And we can have a broader conversation about why that is, but it's not as though there's some kind of absolute state that's rules without law. It's pervasively constituted by law. So I think there is a profound continuity in the sorts of principles that we're discussing that do go far back before the French Revolution. In the American case, Jerry Mashaw from Yale has emphasized that there is a kind of libertarian myth that we have an original constitution that is shattered by the formation of the administrative state in the late 19th century, and that we depart from our original constitution in order to have this administrative state, and therefore our administrative state is under a kind of legal shadow of illegitimacy. And Mashaw's work shows that's just not true. There was no time at which we didn't have an administrative state in the United States. What is true is that the scope of government grew over time, but that's actually an analytically distinct issue about what the competence of government as a whole is, not how to allocate tasks between judges and other sorts of officials. So there's no time in America which we didn't have an administrative state, and it's one of these myths of the common lawyers, I think, that there's this sharp break with the past. So this is all just to pick up Justice Amato's point about commonality and continuity and say I emphatically agree with it, and I think it's very powerful, and we have to resist these myths that try to deny it. Professor Anichino very acutely brings up Posner. This is very kind of wounding for me because jurisprudentially, Dick Posner is the opposite of everything I think, but he's right partly. Let me explain the part where he's right, which is that my view and the Posnerian view are both opposed. We have a common enemy. The common enemy is the libertarian common lawyer who wants to deny the legitimacy of the administrative state. So Pasquale's been very acute to see that. I would say that that's where the common ground ends. Jurisprudentially, I think that although the libertarian common lawyer is wrong, the Posnerian pragmatist is also wrong, because the Posnerian pragmatist simply doesn't understand, is blind to the way the administrative state, the way the non-libertarian administrative state is legalized, which is through a jurisprudence of principle rather than of pragmatism. So this is my Dworkinian side. My message, I guess, a way of summarizing the overall message that I would ascribe to the book, and again, I don't mean to speak for Cass, is that our administrative law is more European than people think, and it's always been more European than people think. It's connected to this very venerable tradition of a jurisprudence of principles that goes back as far as we can see in Western law. And so that's the sense in which I think we are connected to the history of European law in a very profound way. Thank you.
Thanks again, Professor Vermeulen, for moving the discussion further. And if you agree, now President Amato can reply, and then we can finish the second round with Professor Annichino. So President Amato, the floor is yours.
No, I don't have further replies. What I would find it interest now, but we don't have the time to do it, it would be another seminar, is a more specific comparison of the limits beyond which we Europeans and our American colleagues find the rule of law at risk in specific matters, not generally. I mean, the kind of discussion that still exists partially in the States, according to which independent agencies, as long as they are independent, might be illegal. This is a discussion that I don't even want to engage into, because I consider it a nonsense, and it's part of the burden that we owe to the originalist interpreters of the American Constitution, full stop. It's one of their mistakes, and I leave it there. More interesting for me is there was a little bit of our discussion devoted to it, how far we think that retroactivity can go without violating the rule of law. Frequently, our administrations require citizens that have licenses of others to pay increased fees beyond the level established at the beginning of the relationship between them and the administration. Is this retroactive, despite the fact that it refers only to future payments, but it does change the conditions initially established? Does this violate something? Now, this is where the discussion nowadays is interesting, and this is where we measure really how far, with the rule of law, transparency, respect of expectations, morality, we have gone. But we will do it next time, not now.
Thank you, Judge Amato. Okay, Professor Annichino, if you have further considerations or reflection.
Thank you, Professor Vermeulen, for the reply. Just a final consideration, another point, also to give other reading suggestion to the people which are attending. Professor Vermeulen also recently published a paper on the Yellow Journal Forum, which I recommend, where he deals with this Dworkinian defense of administrative law, if we can call that. So, and of course, there is this tripartite distinction there, Roscoe Pound, Carl Smith, and Dworkin, and Professor Vermeulen takes, of course, the Dworkinian position. Now, I thought about the development, recent development of administrative law in Italy under the COVID crisis. And I thought, I mean, this probably applies to other countries. I mean, I have not been studying the administrative reaction of the US in the COVID. I mean, I've done that only for the First Amendment issues, which I usually study. But I would like to see, for instance, how the disbursement of public money has gone, if the procedures have all been respected. Because I mean, if I would take Italy as a baseline of analysis under the COVID crisis, I would be more inclined to side with Smith than with Dworkin, yes, there. Because as also Professor Cassese has repeatedly written, we have had a crisis of the use of instruments of administrative law to react to the COVID crisis. Many of these things probably are going to go before administrative courts, so we will see how things will end up. But the impression is that there has been an abuse of the instrument of administrative law, which were not probably targeted in many ways. And when I was reading to the paper published by Professor Vermeulen, I said maybe Smith was right in that under condition of stress. I mean, the administrative law can jump out of the bandwagon of principles and go in a no-law land. So I was wondering if the COVID crisis made Professor Vermeulen also rethink this, and if he sees that in the next few years, because of the reaction of the public apparatus in different states, a lot of public money mediated by state apparatus and so on, in a situation that looks like a little bit previous, similar historical situation that led to the growth of the bureaucracy apparatus. In few years, we can be like in another webinar discussing of how these principles have changed or have not changed. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anichino. And if you agree, we may conclude just, I will select one question made from one of our participants. Professor Riccardo Puglisi says that a change of the institutional setup in the US that would allow the voters to directly elect the members of the executive instead of letting the governor electing them will we will bring benefits for a stricter judiciary control. So I don't know if Professor Vermeulen wants to say something about this.
Thank you for that question. So I didn't understand the bit at the end. So if in the federal system we had direct election for executive offices the way there is in some states, is the idea that judicial control could be less strict or more strict?
Stricter.
More strict.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. I think it depends on what kind of question that executive official then goes on to address through action. That is, where the question is the ultimate choice of a value, like a rate of trade-off between two desirable things, then I think that the democratic, imprimatur is typically taken under our law to be conclusive. But where you have a means ends question, that is, that the idea is, in order to promote a certain goal, have rational means been chosen, then that question has to be more strictly examined if you have a decision maker who is not giving adequate reasons for doing so. So that'd be my initial instinct, would be to say it a little bit depends on what sort of issue is involved. But it's a very interesting comparison to think about. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, exactly. He says, no, let's strict control voters as a substitute, sorry. So I think you have already answered to this question. So thank you so much for your contribution and for your time in this today live talk. Thanks again to the Center for American Studies for the organization. And as President Amato already suggests, we may think to meet again for a next interesting conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you all again. I'm very grateful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.